The desert does not forgive. He never forgave. Beneath its cruel vastness, men discover who they really are when everything is taken away from them. Thirst reveals the naked soul, stripped of lies and pretensions. There, where the sun punishes mercilessly and the wind carries only empty promises, the true measure of a man emerges as a mirage that becomes real. Jack Coleman had been riding for 3 days through the arid lands of Arizona. The sweat had dried on his forehead, leaving trails of salt that burned like small scars. His grey beard was covered by the red dust that consumed everything in that place, forgotten by God. The canteen on his belt swayed almost empty, producing only a melancholy echo with each movement of the horse. He had left Tombstone with enough provisions for 5 days, but the merciless heat and a forced diversion by bandits had consumed his reserves more quickly than he had anticipated. The horizon stretched infinitely, rippling under the heat like an ocean of sand and stone. Cacti stood like silent sentinels, mute witnesses of countless human tragedies. The sky, too blue to bring hope, weighed down the earth like a heated iron dome. Each breath burned the lungs. Each step of the animal raised more dust that stuck to the already punished skin. Coleman knew the signs well. His tongue had begun to swell, his vision trembled at the edges, and his thoughts became hazy like the hot air dancing over the distant rocks. He had faced the headquarters before, in military campaigns and persecutions that extended beyond what was planned. He knew he had at best a day before his body began to fail completely. It was then that he saw her, a human figure, small in immensity, bent over something on the ground. At first he thought it was another hallucination, one of those that the desert generously offers to the desperate. But as he got closer, the image gained solidity. He was a man, clearly Apache by his clothing and the long black hair that shone in the sun. He was kneeling beside a fallen horse, his hands touching the animal with a gentleness that contrasted with the harshness of the environment. The Apache looked up as Coleman approached. There was no fear there, only a deep resignation that spoke of someone who had already accepted his fate. His face was sunburned, his lips cracked like dry earth. His clothes, once colored with traditional patterns, were now faded and torn. Beside him, the horse breathed hard, clearly disillusioned. Coleman descended from his mount slowly, each movement calculated not to alarm the man. He knew that Apaches could be deadly, even when they seemed harmless. But something in the eyes of that warrior told him that the fight had left his body, replaced by a melancholy acceptance that comes only when death approaches like an old acquaintance. Coleman's canteen contained perhaps 2 gulps of warm water, water precious as gold in that hell of stone and sand, water that could mean the difference between seeing another sunset or joining the bleached bones that dotted that lawless land. His hand trembled imperceptibly as he touched the hot metal of the container. The Apache followed each movement with eyes that seemed to understand more than words could express. There was a dignity in that prostrate man, a nobility that not even the proximity of death could erase. Coleman recognized something of himself in those tired eyes, something that spoke of battles lost and honor maintained even when everything else had fallen apart. The wind blew between them, carrying the smell of dry sage and warm earth. The silence stretched out like an unspoken prayer, weighed down with the weight of the decisions that shape the destiny of men. Coleman knew that this moment would define not only who he was, but who he would choose to be when confronted with the purest essence of humanity. His fingers clenched the canteen. The water gently rattled, a sound that echoed like heavenly music in that silent desert. The Apache closed his eyes, perhaps preparing for the end he thought inevitable, but Coleman had made his decision, a decision that would resonate through the years as an echo of kindness in a world too cruel to support such generosity. There are times in a man's life when all words become unnecessary, moments when the soul speaks louder than reason, when the heart dictates actions that the mind would never approve of. The desert had reduced 2 men to their purest essence, stripping them of everything except the fundamental choice between saving themselves or saving another. Coleman removed the canteen from his belt with deliberate movements. The metal was hot as red-hot iron, warmed by the relentless sun that reigned over that desolate land. Every drop of water inside represented precious minutes of life, perhaps hours if managed wisely. He knew that. Apache knew it too. The warrior watched in silence as Coleman knelt beside him. There was no pleading in his eyes, only a serene curiosity about the intentions of that white man who emerged from the heat like a vision. His lips were so chapped that they looked like dry bark, and his breath came in small gasps that spoke of a body on the verge of collapse. Coleman uncapped the canteen. The metallic sound echoed in the air like a distant bell. The water shook gently, and for a moment, both men were mesmerized by that sound that represented life in its most elemental form. The Apache closed his eyes, perhaps imagining the coolness running down his parched throat, or perhaps just accepting that such relief was not meant for him. But Coleman raised the canteen toward the Apache's lips. The gesture was so unexpected that the warrior opened his eyes in genuine surprise. For the first time since they met, something other than resignation shone on that face marked by suffering. It was pure unbelief, as if witnessing a miracle that defied all logic. The first drop touched the cracked lips of the Apache, then the second. Coleman tilted the canteen carefully, allowing the warm water to trickle down slowly, drop by drop. The Apache drank with an almost religious reverence, his eyes fixed on the face of the man who offered him his life in liquid form. When the canteen emptied completely, Coleman put it aside. There was nothing else. His last store of water had been given to a stranger, to a man of a race with whom his own people had been waging war for generations. But there, under that sun which treated all men with equal cruelty, such distinctions seemed small and insignificant. The Apache tried to speak, but his voice came out like a harsh whisper that the wind carried. Coleman didn't need to understand the words to understand the meaning. Gratitude transcends languages and cultures when it springs from a heart touched by impossible generosity. Hours passed. The sun continued its relentless march through the cloudless sky. Coleman felt his strength slipping away like sand between his fingers. Thirst, now intensified by the complete absence of water, began to take its toll. His vision blurred at the edges, and waves of heat seemed to spring from within his own body. The Apache, strengthened by the incoming water, tried to help as best they could. He dragged dry branches to create a small shadow, gestured towards the horizon as if he knew some distant source of water. But they both knew it was too late for Coleman. The white man had sealed his own fate with an act of compassion that defied all survival. As the sun began to decline, painting the sky with orange hues reminiscent of fire, Coleman collapsed. His body, finally overcome by thirst and heat, gave in to the inevitability he had chosen to accept when he emptied his canteen. The Apache stood by his side, a silent vigil that spoke of mutual honor and respect. The night brought a relative freshness, but it also brought something more. In the distance, almost imperceptible at first, a cloud of dust rose. Then another. The Apache raised his head, his heightened senses picking up on something that Coleman, in his weakened state, couldn't perceive. They were knights, many knights, and they were coming towards him. The Apache's heart raced when it recognized the familiar patterns of that approach. Your tribe, your brothers. They had come looking for him, following tracks that only eyes trained in ancient traditions could decipher. But how would they explain the presence of the white man? How would they understand what he had witnessed there, in the heart of the desert, where goodness had blossomed like an impossible flower in barren soil? There are stories that the desert winds carry for generations, whispering through the canyons about acts that defy human comprehension. Stories about moments when the line between enemy and brother dissolves like salt in water, revealing deeper truths that any war could teach. The dust that was approaching brought with it one of these stories, not yet written, but about to become legend. The Apache warriors emerged from the darkness as shadows taking shape. There were 12 mounted men, their faces painted for war, spears raised against the starry sky. They came looking for their lost brother, following tracks invisible to the untrained eye, reading signs that the earth left like pages of an ancestral book. But what they found defied all their expectations. The wounded Apache rose with difficulty when he recognized the leader of the group. It was his blood brother, a respected warrior whose deeds in battle were sung around tribal fires. The leader's eyes moved quickly between his brother and the unconscious white man next to him, trying to decipher the strange scene unfolding under the moonlight. Through gestures and words whispered in their ancestral language, the wounded Apache told what he had witnessed. He spoke about shared water, about impossible generosity, about a man who chose the death of another over his own salvation. His words were punctuated by meaning-laden silences, each pause revealing the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The warriors looked at each other with a mixture of incredulity and respect. In their culture, water was sacred, especially in the desert. Sharing it meant sharing one's own life. That a white man, traditionally seen as an enemy, would make such a sacrifice defied everything they knew about that race that had invaded their land. The tribe leader dismounted and approached Coleman. He placed his hand on the unconscious man's chest, feeling the heart that was still beating, weak but persistent. There was something about that sunny, grief-scarred face that spoke of honor, a quality that transcended differences in skin and culture. This was no ordinary enemy. It was something rarer and more precious. Quickly, the Apaches organized a makeshift camp. They erected a small tent out of furs and fabrics, creating shade to protect Coleman from the serene night that could be fatal in his weakened state. They brought fresh water from their own supplies, administering it drop by drop to the white man's parched lips. One of the warriors, known for his knowledge of traditional medicine, examined Coleman with expert hands. He recognized the signs of severe dehydration, but also something deeper, an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was as if man had given not only his water, but part of his own essence to save another. Throughout the night, the Apaches kept vigil. They took turns in care, offering water in small quantities, protecting the unconscious man from the cold that the desert brought when the sun went down. It was a care they normally reserved only for their own war-wounded, but something in the act witnessed by their brother had touched something deep in their warrior souls. When the aurora painted the sky with shades of pink and gold, Coleman opened his eyes for the first time in hours. His vision was blurry, but he gradually gained focus. I expected to see only sand and cacti, perhaps the vultures circling in the sky. Instead, he found painted faces watching him with a respectful curiosity that he could not fully comprehend. The Apache he had saved was kneeling beside him, holding a small container of water. His eyes shone with a gratitude that seemed to light up the entire camp. Around them, the warriors watched in silence, their expressions revealing a mixture of admiration and something that seemed almost reverent. Coleman tried to sit up, but gentle hands kept him lying down. A gourd of water was brought to his lips, and he drank slowly, each sip bringing back a bit of the life that had almost slipped through his fingers. The tribe leader approached and said something in Apache, his voice charged with a solemnity that transcended language barriers. The Apache that Coleman had saved, he translated with gestures and a few words in English that he knew. The leader was saying that a man capable of such a sacrifice was not an enemy of his tribe. It was something rarer. He was a brother chosen by the desert itself, tested by the sun and considered worthy. And as such, he would be treated with the honor reserved for the greatest warriors. Coleman closed his eyes again, not from exhaustion this time, but from an emotion he couldn't name. He had departed Tombstone as an ordinary man, pursuing worldly goals through hostile lands. Now he found himself at the center of something bigger, something that would change not only his life, but potentially the relations between two peoples who considered each other mortal enemies. The desert teaches that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom of building bridges, where once there were only chasms. For 3 days, Coleman remained in the care of the Apache tribe, regaining not only his physical strength, but discovering a deeper understanding of the nature of humanity that transcends all man-made boundaries. Each morning brought new rituals of care. The women of the tribe prepared medicinal herbs harvested from the distant mountains, creating potions that accelerated recovery and purified blood poisoned by extreme thirst. The men shared their rations of jerky and desert fruit, treating Coleman not as a prisoner or intruder, but as a respected member of their temporary community. The Apache that Coleman had saved, whose name was Ayana, turned out to be a respected storyteller in his tribe. During the nights around the campfire, he narrated in his ancestral language what he had witnessed in the desert, his voice charged with awe and awe. The words danced in the air along with the flames, creating a magical atmosphere where heroism gained epic dimensions. Coleman observed these nocturnal ceremonies with increasing fascination. Although she didn't understand the words, she felt the emotional power of Ayana's narratives. He saw in the firelit faces how his story was turning into something greater, a legend that would be passed down through the generations as an example of kindness in a cruel world. The leader of the tribe, who called himself Takoda, spent long hours talking to Coleman through gestures and drawings in the sand. He talked about the ancient traditions of his people, about how water was considered sacred, about how the act of sharing it created bonds stronger than any peace treaty. His eyes shone with a wisdom accumulated through decades of living in harmony with that hostile land. During one of these conversations, Dakota revealed something that surprised Coleman deeply. The tribe had been watching the activities of white men in the region for months, preparing for what they saw as an inevitable war. But the act of generosity witnessed by Ayanna had planted a seed of doubt in their warrior hearts. If a white man could show such compassion, perhaps not all of them were enemies to be fought. On the third night, something extraordinary happened. Dakota summoned the entire tribal council for a special ceremony. Coleman was invited to sit in the center of the circle, surrounded by warriors whose painted faces reflected the dancing light of fire. The ritual that followed was something that few white men had witnessed and survived to recount. One by one, the warriors stood up and talked about Coleman. Ayanna translated fragments explaining how each man saw in him qualities that they respected: courage, compassion, honor, sacrifice. Words that in his culture defined not only a good man, but a true warrior. Someone who fights not only with weapons, but with his heart. The climax of the ceremony came as Dakota stood up, holding a small, smooth blue stone that shone like a fragment of the night sky. It was a sacred turquoise, Ayanna explained, passed down through generations of tribal leaders. It represented eternal water, the source of all life, the most precious element that the desert knew. With solemn movements charged with ancestral significance, Dakota placed the stone in Coleman's hands. Through Ayanna, he explained that he was being adopted as a brother of the tribe, an honor reserved only for those who had proven their worth through actions that touched the Apache soul itself. It was a recognition that transcended race and culture, based purely on the measure of a man's heart. The tears that ran down Coleman's tanned face came not from physical weakness, but from an overwhelming emotion he couldn't name. He had entered that wilderness as an ordinary man, pursuing worldly personal goals. Now he found himself at the center of something sacred, a bridge between two worlds that considered each other irreconcilable. But the ceremony also brought a heavy responsibility. Dakota explained that Coleman now carried with him not only the honor of his new Apache family, but also the obligation to be a messenger between the two peoples. Their story should be told. Their actions should inspire others to see beyond the superficial differences that fueled so much unnecessary violence. When the ceremony was over and the warriors retreated to their tents, Coleman remained awake under the starry sky, holding the sacred turquoise between his calloused hands. The stone was warm, as if it contained the warmth of all the hearts that had touched it before him. He knew that his life had changed forever in that moment, that he could never again simply be Jack Coleman, the man who wandered the West in search of fortune. Now it was the man who had given his last drop of water to a stranger, the man who had been chosen by the desert itself to prove that goodness still existed in a world seemingly hardened by violence. And with that realization came the realization that his true journey was just beginning. There are times in human history when a single act of kindness echoes through the ages, like a stone thrown into a serene lake, creating waves that spread far beyond the original point of impact. What happened in that desert has not only remained a precious memory in the hearts of those who witnessed it, but has become a catalyst for changes that no one could have foreseen. Coleman spent 2 more days with the tribe before it was time to say goodbye. Dakota had decided that his new white brother needed to return to the world of men of his race to fulfill the destiny that the desert itself had mapped out for him. But he would not leave empty-handed or alone. The tribe prepared abundant supplies for their journey and assigned 3 warriors to escort them to the edge of Apache territory. On the morning of the match, something unexpected happened. Ayanna announced her decision to accompany Coleman, not only as an escort, but as a permanent companion in his mission to build bridges between the two peoples. The decision surprised even Dakota, but the tribal leader recognized the wisdom behind it. Who better than the man saved by Coleman's generosity to testify to the extraordinary character of that white man? The journey back to civilization proved to be a transformative experience for both men. Coleman discovered through Ayanna details about Apache culture that he had never imagined. He learned about his deep connection to the land, his reverence for nature, his sophisticated understanding of wilderness survival. Gradually, he began to see his people through different eyes, recognizing the ignorance and prejudices that fueled so much unnecessary conflict. Ayanna, for her part, watched with growing fascination as Coleman's determination to honor the responsibility she had accepted. The white man talked constantly about ways to share his experience, to convince other settlers that peace was possible, that mutual understanding could replace the violence that had dominated relations between the two peoples for so long. When they finally spotted the first tombstone buildings on the horizon, both men knew they were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives. The city was in a state of increasing tension due to rumors of impending Apache attacks. The sight of Coleman arriving accompanied by an Apache warrior caused an immediate uproar among the inhabitants. But Coleman was prepared. In the following days, he began to tell his story. He spoke in halls, churches, private homes, to anyone willing to listen. His narrative was simple but powerful. A man in despair, an impossible choice, and the unexpected consequences of an act of pure compassion. Ayana always remained by his side, her presence serving as living proof of the truthfulness of every word. Initially, many received the story with skepticism. How could an Apache be trusted? How could they be sure that it was not some elaborate strategy of war? But the sincerity evident in both men, combined with details that only someone who lived through the experience could know, gradually won hearts and minds. The sacred turquoise that Coleman carried became a powerful symbol of his transformation. When people saw it, when he explained its meaning and how he had been gifted with it, something changed on their faces. It was impossible to deny the authenticity of that small blue stone that shone like a fragment of the sky, carrying with it the weight of millennial traditions and the promise of a different future. Gradually, the story spread beyond Tombstone. Travelers took it to other cities, where it was retold and retold, each narrative adding new details and nuances. Coleman and Ayana visited communities across the territory, their unlikely duo serving as a living example that cooperation between Apaches and settlers was not only possible, but could be mutually beneficial. The impact of his mission was gradual, but profound. Merchants began trading directly with Apache tribes, finding that they could obtain valuable goods without the need for conflict. Farmers learned cultivation techniques adapted to the arid climate that the natives had perfected over centuries. Doctors began to study traditional medicinal plants that proved surprisingly effective. It was not a complete or immediate transformation. There were still conflicts. There was still resistance on both sides. But something fundamental had changed in the region. There was now a concrete example that another approach was possible, a true story about men who chose to see humanity where they had previously seen only enemies. Years later, when Coleman was an elderly man whose hair had turned completely white under the desert sun, he still carried the sacred turquoise in his pocket. Ayana had remained his faithful companion through all the journeys, and together they had built something that transcended their individual origins, a living legend about the transformative power of compassion. Sitting on his porch one starry night, looking out over the same desert where it had all begun, Coleman reflected on the extraordinary journey that a simple decision had unleashed. He had given his last drop of water to a stranger, hoping to die as a result. Instead, he had found a fuller and more meaningful life than he had ever dreamed possible. The desert was still there, unchanged in its vastness, but the people who inhabited it had changed. And sometimes, when the wind blew from a certain direction, Coleman could swear he still heard the echoes of that sacred ceremony, the voices of Apache warriors singing about a white man who proved that goodness still existed in the world. The story of his last drop of water had become immortal, passed down from generation to generation, reminding everyone that in moments of choosing between one's own good and the good of another, the decision we make defines not only who we are, but who we can become. If this story of sacrifice and redemption in the heart of the desert has touched your soul, you can't miss the next Wild West legends we have prepared for you. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of these narratives that reveal the true spirit of the Wild West.